we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. I'm John Abbott, President and CEO here at WGBH, GBH. We dropped that W. Just to remind ourselves that we're not just a broadcaster, but we're frankly busy in the community and on digital platforms, and I think hopefully public media growing and growing in our role and relevance in everybody's daily lives. It is really nice to see all of you here in our theater as this fall kicks in and we are, sort of post-pandemic, right? And we built this theater, I was just saying to our esteemed panelists, and opened this building 15 years ago. And this theater space has been host to many of the most important conversations we've had with community leaders and gatherings that have helped inform our work. So we're very, very honored to host tonight's important discussion on one of the most pressing topics in higher education and, quite frankly, in all of our daily lives. Civility, respect, and inclusion, along with freedom of expression and the exchange of diverse perspectives, are values that are at the very heart of democracy, and they're also at the core of what public media and GBH aspire to offer every day in service to you as your public media organization. In fact, public media is the last locally owned, governed, and operated media in our country, and we see this as a very special responsibility. In fact, I flew in last night from a meeting in Denver where 35 of the largest, 35 cities, our public media organizations, were coming together to have conversations about our work in our communities and to compare ideas, compare notes about our future and how we connect with the leaders in our community to define what public media can be, as distinct from a commercial media system that, frankly, is in a significant state of disruption, and one could say paying less and less attention to and affording itself less and less time and attention to the issues that are so essential to communities. We recognize that we sit alongside all of you in our community and must work together to combat hate crimes, anti-Semitism, racism, and cancel culture so that individuals are empowered to fully engage in the exchange of ideas, in spirited debate, and with the dignity all deserve as human beings. GBH is committed to bringing our community together for ongoing dialogues and forums such as this one in this space, and of course on the radio and on television. We recognize and celebrate the role that higher ed institutions can play and should play around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in fact, in the GBH charter, there are always a group of educational and cultural institutions who are afforded and asked to serve on our board of trustees. There are as many as 5, and we have leaders from higher ed always on the GBH board. And I was saying to our panel that our connection to those leaders and what they bring to our discussion around our trustees table is really irreplaceable. So it makes this evening that much more meaningful for me. We're grateful to host tonight's event alongside the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, the Boston Foundation, and Get Konnected. And we are very fortunate to have our good friend Colette Phillips here with us, leading us in this critically important discussion, along with a remarkable, esteemed panel of leaders in our higher ed community, Marta Rosa and Drs. Marissa Kelly and Robert Johnson, who all recognize the important and catalytic role that higher education can play as a force for good, truly a vital resource, force for good and social change. So please join me in welcoming Colette Phillips, our dear friend, who will get us started and enjoy the evening. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, John, and thank you to GBH, who is always at the epicenter whenever there are important discussions and issues that need to be unpacked and engaged on. My name is Colette Phillips, and many of you know me. This, I was saying, is our only our second in-person event in 3 years. So we're used to having hundreds of people. And I think people are still getting used to getting back. So I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank all of our partners on tonight's event. Of course, GBH and AQ Mass, and also the EOS Foundation, the Boston Foundation, and Get Connected. I know I am not as tall and handsome as Lee Pelton. Lee was supposed to be moderating this panel, but had to be out of town, was a little concerned about getting back here on time to make it, and so I'm pinch hitting for him, so you got me. And we have an absolutely wonderful panel, which I will get into. I want to say a big shout out to Sandra Lopez Burke, the Managing Director of Government and Community Relations at GBH. And also, where is Josh Poirier, who has just done a phenomenal job? When I reached out to John about hosting this event, there was literally no hesitation. So thank you, John, for being there. I want to say a big thank you also to all of you, to the team that helped to put this together. Sonia Hagopian, who was my partner in crime in scripting this and helping me pull the script together. My team of Maggie, and also our new engagement and partnership associate, who looks everything like Barack Obama, Greg Anthony Blaze. And thank you all for being here. And we will, without further ado, we'll get into this program. So I'm going to go sit. Oh, no, I'm going to ask Marissa to say a few words, who is the president of AQ Mass. Do you want to come up, or you want to?
Sure, I will be very brief, but just to distinguish my roles. It is really a pleasure to be here. I am actually the chair of the AQ Mass board, and so here very proudly representing AQ as well as Suffolk University when I go back and sit down in that chair. The colleges and universities that are represented by the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities of Massachusetts, AQ Mass, are really committed to the issues of diversity and inclusion and to fostering civility, which is just so critical and frankly in too short a supply right now. We have worked collaboratively in the last 2 years to look at ways that we can, across institutions, across the state of Massachusetts and across institutions of higher education, look at ways that we can collaborate to foster diversity and inclusion and civility across the Commonwealth. And so it really is an honor to be a co-sponsor of this event. And on behalf of our president, Rob McCarron, who absolutely wanted to be here, but like Lee Pelton also had to be out of town, I just want to welcome you and thank you for being part of this conversation tonight.
So this is a very important and I could say timely discussion. Civility, respect, and inclusivity in age of cancel culture. I am going to introduce each of our panels so that you will have a little background on who they are. Marissa Kelly is the 11th president of Suffolk University, where she is driving momentum through her focus on educational excellence, experiential learning, global reach, and inclusion, all aimed at ensuring that students are prepared for career success and community impact. She has been resolute in affirming Suffolk's long-standing commitment to inclusivity as a hallmark at Suffolk as a Suffolk education and for Suffolk graduates, and believes the university's strength is greater because of diversity. She was named Suffolk's permanent president in March of 2018 after guiding the university for more than 20 months. She has recommended or recommitted the university to the essential access and opportunity mission with a view forward and towards empowering and supporting students today and in the future. She has championed career readiness at Suffolk and led the development of the Reimagined Center for Career Equity, Development and Success, which actively activates and advocates for greater equity and access in the workforce. She's an advocate for global awareness and believes in transformative power of international education, whether students are studying at Suffolk's Boston or Madrid campuses through its Global Gateway or travel seminar programs, or with dozens of university partners around the world. So please welcome Dr. Kelly. Dr. Robert Johnson is the 6th president of Western New England University, located in Springfield, Massachusetts. So you get the gold star for traveling the furthest. Thank God we're not in Texas. He is the first African American president of the university, took the helm in 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, charged with leading the institution as it embarks on its 2nd century. His unyielding belief in higher education as a public good and as a path for transforming individual lives has led him to dedicate his 30-year career in preparing students to adapt and succeed in a dynamic future. One where jobs as we know it may no longer exist and career mobility is the norm, and individuals are responsible for continuously adding and creating new value. A proponent of innovation and entrepreneurship, hallmarks of Dr. Johnson's leadership includes elevating institutional stature and competitive market position, national recognition, enrollment growth, and resource development success, fast-tracked facilities and infrastructure improvement, and innovating for social impact when leading one of the first higher education institutions in the nation to achieve a 100% social impact goal for its endowment. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Johnson. Dr. Marta Rosa is the executive vice president, and I take the liberty of calling her really the provost and is a visionary leader at Roxbury Community College. I'll tell Jackie. And a serial social entrepreneur who founded several nonprofits focused on improving the quality of life for residents in Chelsea. Prior to entering higher ed, she was the first Latina to be elected to public office in the city of Chelsea, serving 6 years on the school committee and 3 years on the Chelsea City Council. She was the CEO of a $13 million community-based organization, the Child Care Resource Center, providing comprehensive family support and professional development for families both here in the region and nationally. She brings an inclusive and intentional lens to higher education, where she has close to 2 decades of experience. She has served as the founding director of Wheelock College's Aspire Institute, which raised over $20 million in innovative funds, and as the Chief Diversity Officer and Executive Director for Government and External Affairs and Community Impact at Wheelock. She's currently overseeing Roxbury Community College's year-long 50th anniversary celebration, slated for 2023. And if I know Marta, it is going to be phenomenal. So join me in welcoming Dr. Rosa. Well, we are here in Massachusetts, which we all know is the Athens of higher education. And we all believe that we would like to see more women and more people of color at the helm. And I think at this point, we have more women and people of color at the helm at higher education institutions than at any other time in the history. But I know my good friend Andrea Silber of EOS will say, we can do better. And I'm in agreement with her. So looking at this panel, I would say that this is a great representation of gender and racial diversity that is taking place in higher education in our Commonwealth. And I can tell you that each of our panelists were selected with intentionality. For the work that they're doing, they are very strong, impact-focused president and student-centric, and recognizes that students today must come out of institutions of higher ed with a broad, global, diverse, and inclusive lens. So I thank you all for that. Higher education, DE&I, I'm going to talk about diversity. It has become the clarion call for today's corporate and institutional work environment. And this is to all of our presidents. How do you promote DE&I in a predominantly white institution where DE&I has not historically been either a priority or at the top of mind? Dr. Kelly, would you like to take that one?
Sure. So first, I want to acknowledge that, yes, Suffolk University is still predominantly white by percentage, but not by a lot. Just to give you an example, 41% of our first-year class this year are first-generation college students. Now, they're not all students of color, but there is a huge overlap there. And overall, it's about 30% of our students who identify as from a historically underrepresented group. And in addition, we have a large LGBTQ plus population. So I say that not because we don't have a lot of work to do and you know that we have been doing and need to continue to do, but we have always, as an institution, had a commitment to access and opportunity. In fact, it was really back in 1906. We were founded originally as a law school to give access to the legal profession for people who were being blocked from more established, prominent places, not to pick on Harvard, but Harvard as an example, right? Because at that time, it was, you know, it was really a very challenging situation. So we haven't always lived up to that dream of who we could be as an institution, but it has been part of who we are and in our DNA, which in many ways gives me a great advantage because I can hearken back to that history in helping to focus the community on our need to continue to make progress in living up to rather that founding charge. So that's incredibly helpful for me. And it helps that we have a diverse student body that is working with us to ensure that we are always developing programs that help to train our faculty, our staff, our administrators, in many of the ways that we need to be when we fall short. And there are a lot of programs I could talk at. We have an Ambassadors for Inclusion program. We have peer diversity educators because we want students involved in this. We do an enormous amount of training in inclusive hiring practices. In fact, that's fairly new for us, but we simply have not made the progress in having a faculty and staff that looks like our student body in the way that we need to. And so can't do a search for a position at Suffolk without having a search committee chair that has gone through that inclusive training process. And and it has been beginning to make a difference, which is fabulous. So lots of specific programs we could talk about, but I will just say one more thing, and then I'm sure others would like to jump in on this question. One of the things that I've really come to realize is the importance of my presence, or the presence of diversity in leadership at the, I don't like the word top, but for lack of a better word, at the top, visible leadership, to make a difference in the lives of students. My wife and I both, when we are on campus, will get stopped by students to just say, I just want to take a minute to tell you how much it means just to see you and to see what you're doing. And so that's always reinforced for me the importance of focusing on representation in the community. It's not sufficient, but it is an important part of this process.
I believe that representation matters. So thank you. Dr. Johnson?
I would echo everything that Marissa has said, and I want to, I think, even evolve a little bit more about leadership and the leadership team. And on our campus, when I first arrived, prior to me arriving, the entire leadership team did not have any representation of people of color. Today, the entire leadership team has 40% in terms of people of color, but it goes further than that. So we have race and gender diversity with the leadership team, but now I hold the leadership team accountable as part of their performance metrics, and we're now beginning to see the diversity cascade down throughout the organization. So I think a good example would be, or to give you an example of the deep-rooted nature of the lack of diversity on campus when I arrived. When you meet with your entire athletics department, your coaches and staff, and you're sitting in a room and no one looks like me, there's a problem. And so, when you have structural and institutional systems in place, you can't just change them. You have to deconstruct them.
Yes.
And then after you deconstruct them, then you can construct the model that will then give all students, faculty, and staff a sense of belonging, inclusion, the whole 9 yards. When I first arrived, everybody said, we just need to hire a chief diversity officer. I said, no, we don't. We need to understand what the baseline, where we are as a baseline, so that we can create a plan and a path forward that will not be symbolism, but will be substance. And I think all too often organizations decide to do things that are symbolic, but they have no substance behind them. So if you take all of the things that Marissa talked about, and then you start talking about holding accountability among the leadership team and in the hiring practices, you can then bring about change within the organization.
Just to add, the intentionality that you hear from my colleagues, it's really what makes a difference in my mind. It's intentionality and it's courage. It's presidents who like Jackie Jenkins Scott when I worked with her at Wheelock College as the chief diversity officer, and that was a predominantly white institution. It's having a president who really cares about the issue and is willing to make the changes that are necessary or begin to have the conversations that are going to bring about change, because change doesn't happen automatically. And a lot of people say, oh yeah, I want a diverse college, and then diversity comes and then we don't know what to do with it. And so the intentionality is really important. I have the privilege now of working at Roxbury Community College, one of the 15 community colleges in the state, and we've been designated as a predominantly black institution, a PBI, which I'm very proud of. It's a very different experience in terms of diversity than I had when I worked for 12 years and worked in the president's cabinet at Wheelock College. So the intentionality remains, but the responses are different.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the challenges that seem to have arisen post-pandemic and in the face of America's racial reckoning. And I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about how the pandemic and racial awakening and reckoning have impacted your respective institutions. And I will just throw it out, and whoever wants to go first, because I don't want to put President Kelly on the hot seat again.
It wouldn't be fair to my
Yeah.
colleagues.
No, you're too kind. No, so I think this reckoning, if you will, that has come about, slightly pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and currently post-pandemic, it is real. And I think as leaders within the academy, at least for me, and on my campus, I've stood up in front of the campus in town hall meetings and literally have said, we need to have a conversation about race. So I think, we have to be not in your face with it, but we have to be authentic with it. We can't walk around and pretend as if we don't have a problem. Because from where I sit, it is not sufficient to say, oh yeah, everybody's committed to DEI. Yes, we want social justice. But if there's no movement in the needle, and if we're not having frank conversations about what is taking place. We had an incident last year, right about now, this week. One of my staff people said, I'm having PTSD. We've resolved it. But it was a racial situation that took place in a class. And, I'm like, we have zero tolerance. Some people wanted to debate, no, we have no tolerance. And, I think the thing that is most interesting, I think that there are certain things that we as presidents have to be willing to be on the front page of the Boston Globe about, okay? And you don't care what the cost is. My Uncle Bob used to always say, just do the right thing. And if you do the right thing and you're authentic with it, and we have these frank, candid conversations about race on our campus, and the students is one piece, but see, I think it has to start with the faculty and staff, because I think, and it's not just on my campus. I've worked at 7 different colleges and universities throughout my career, and there's this tendency that we want to put it on the students and say, the students need to figure this out and they need to get it right, as if they're coming to us with a deficit. And I think my thing is we need to ask ourselves, what systems and support mechanisms do we have in place for people we are inviting to our campus so that they will have a really, really good experience? And if we don't have those systems in place, if we don't have that infrastructure in place, we ought not be bringing them to our campus. And I think that is the push and pull with this. So this reckoning is that we also have to allow students to have a voice. Yes. To have a voice, to be included in conversations, And we as leaders, I'm in this thing now about talking with people about the importance of learning, unlearning, and relearning as a steady state. And it's one thing for us to tell our students that that's what they have to do in order to be prepared to go out into a global society and leave it better than the way they found it. But now I'm really harping upon our leadership, our staff, our faculty. We need to learn, unlearn, and relearn as a steady state. Marissa will tell you the way that we led 3 years ago, if we're doing it exactly the same today, we are obsolete. We've had to unlearn some things, haven't we?
Absolutely.
And relearn. And that's going to be the new normal. So I think ambiguity and finding comfort with that in all things that we do.
That's brilliant.
I really like this this idea of a new normal.
Yes.
And that lingo has been around for a while, but it's so applicable to today. And in this new normal, we have to learn how to be more civil and really exercise respect for various opinions. And some of that has been lost in our country, both in the political arena, where you see it happening in bad ways, and on our campuses, frankly. At Wheelock, the students were becoming more diverse because that was one of the president's goals, was to diversify that campus. That diversity created a lot of tension amongst not just the students, but not in the student body, but with the faculty, who didn't know how to respond to those students. And so how do we prepare the campuses to be ready for diversity? It's not just enough to hire the chief diversity officer. It's not just enough, and that person is usually a part-time person who has 10 other titles in most colleges.
In an office of one, right?
In an office of one or a half. And so the students were having the conversations and the dialogues in a really good way. But then they go to classrooms and faculty were using the N-word because they were choosing their academic freedom. And so there's the tension, right? And how do we prepare our campuses to be ready for the students? As opposed to what you were saying the other way around, right?
That's right.
That we expect the students they have to be a part of the dialogue. It's got to be intentional, and we have to have courage as leaders in these institutions to say, yeah, we have to have this conversation, and it'll be painful at times.
Do you want to add to that?
Just I absolutely agree with everything you both just said, and so I just want to make one point that's completely different, just to because it's something that struck me really in the last 6 months or so as we've come out of the pandemic a bit more. I don't think we can say we're totally past it, but whatever this new normal is, this period of racial reckoning has had a dramatic impact, again, in lots of ways on campuses, but it has had a significant impact in corporations.
That's right.
And what I'm finding now is that it's much easier to get doors open when I go and talk about the diversity of our student body and their preparation for various professional tracks, because there is sudden both pressure and internally and externally, on corporations and businesses of all sizes and shapes to diversify their workforce.
That's right.
And so it has actually opened conversations and opportunities for students that were much more challenging to get those doors open a couple years ago. So it's just completely different, but I thought worth mentioning.
And one other point with the racial reckoning, talking about the new normal. I think it's important for leaders to understand we're writing the chapter for what this normal is going to look like. So new normal is not something that's happening to us. We have to be intentional about creating it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Martha, you touched on something about sort of what's happening in our country today. And I feel that there is a bubbling up. And, I don't mean to go political on this, but we have to. This past week, we heard an ugly, vitriolic, racist comment made by a senator from Alabama. And we heard an anti-Semitic slur and trope made by a former president. And I am still waiting for elected officials from the party they represent to condemn that. And what is troubling to me is we are normalizing that kind of behavior. We are accepting that as the new norm in the political sphere. And that in itself brings me to the topic of an increase in anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness that seems to be taking place on campus, and really fueled by this sense of, I can say whatever I want, you know, it's open field day, and in the realm of cancel culture where people get basically shot down. I have friends who have children, Jewish children, at institutions where they will not declare their Judaism because of fear. That to me just seems crazy, that you cannot be who you are, your authentic self, on the institution you have chosen to go to school because of fear. And so I would be interested in hearing from each of you, how can we be addressing this with a survey from the Stop the Anti-Semitism that says 55% of Jewish students said that they have experienced anti-Semitism on their campus. And another high level of Black students, for example, as recently as early this year, UMass Amherst had an incident where students of Black organizations got an ugly, vitriolic email using racial epithets. And so I would love to hear from you. And I hear the word courage. And I think it's going to take courage to do that. So I would love to hear your thoughts about how does a campus really not flatten and downplay difference in opinions, but how do you sort of create an environment where we can go back to civility and respect?
At Roxbury Community College, we've begun, because we've noticed this, this word civility, respect, ability to talk together. I think one of the things that pandemic did is it isolated people. And so we weren't talking together very well before pandemic. We are worse at it after pandemic. And so we've begun to take a look at our values. What are the values that the institution holds dear? And what are the guiding principles to help us to move and to live together and work together within those values? And so we've just begun this exercise because we felt it was important to resurrect our values, to resurrect our commitment to each other, and to begin those conversations. To your anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism, I would add anti-immigrant. That population, all the way from political folks on down, gets spoken of in very derogatory ways. And so we're in our institutions, I think, and I don't know if you agree, we're fighting against a trend that comes from outside of us. And those external forces influence what happens on campuses. And we have to be able to act quickly. And so we have to strengthen our value systems and strengthen our guiding principles and strengthen what's acceptable. The only ifs. You can be part of this community only if, right?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I think as leaders, we have to draw a very bright line in terms of what we believe and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And on our campus, I talk about civility, mutual respect, okay, civil discourse, and doing it with a sense of humanity. And I often use the example that we ought to be able to have dialogue and agree to disagree. We ought to be able to have Benjamin Netanyahu and Louis Farrakhan on the same stage, and the house doesn't burn down. That is what we're all about. That is who we are. And if we do that, then we're headed in the right direction. So, for me, my message to the campus is real simple. If that's not for you, you can't be here.
I like that. That, to me, is what courage is about and commitment. I think presidents are going to have to step out and stand up to the mob, because I know that Paula Johnson at Wellesley College, who took a very strong stance against anti-Semitism, was pilloried by faculty, by students, by donors, by board members, and she had the courage to stand up. And I like what you said, Dr. Johnson, that maybe presidents need to say to students, faculty, and others, we have zero tolerance for this kind of behavior, and maybe this may not be the campus for you.
And I think we have to make a distinction between this type of behavior. You can believe what you want to believe.
That's right.
Okay? I don't care if you're extreme right or extreme left or any place in between. You can believe that. But we can have a conversation with civil discourse and mutual respect.
Yes.
But when you start trying to burn the house down, no. If you're going to have behavior that is counter to that, no. Right?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Absolutely. I think it requires leadership, not just frankly from the president, although first and foremost, I think it falls on us, but also really throughout the organization. We need the leadership team, deans, board members who are willing to back the president. I mean, the fact that Paula was pilloried by members of her own board says, you know what's not the right board.
That's right.
I mean,
That's right.
they don't belong there as, in that role at an educational institution. Faculty and students, and in addition to that leadership, I also think to really we need to also take seriously our role as educational institutions in fostering civil discourse. So creating environments, structures where students are coming together, whether it's an actual debate with people on two sides of an issue, that's clearly important, but also, on an important personal level, and this, of course, these things can be very helpful in fostering trust and understanding across racial, cultural, religious lines. Things like healing circles, for example, which I think can be really important ways to help people come together and understand, maybe around a particular issue, but just also in general, how to listen.
That's right.
Because we have lost as a society the ability to listen to people with whom we disagree. And we have a responsibility to help foster that skill. It's really a skill. It's a skill of human interaction, which I think is so critical, and we have a responsibility to be focused on that for our students.
And the human interaction piece is so important. Anytime you have students sitting in the same room, living together and texting each other, right? We have more devices that connect us,
Yes.
yet we're more isolated.
Yes.
And we have created these echo chambers with the social media, where I'm only interacting and communicating with people who believe what I believe. So I'm never getting an opposing view. So then when what happened at Wellesley with Paula and what have you, it just magnifies. It just magnifies.
Well, all of you said something that I really think is so necessary, and I hope that this is happening throughout institutions, and that is having training for faculty. Because you mentioned, Rosa, that people on the Wheelock campus were using the N-word in their student classroom. That's scary. And I like the fact that Dr. Kelly and Dr. Johnson, you talked about really having training, bias training, and also diversity and inclusion training for your staff and your people on campus, because that to me is also very important.
Training is critical, but it has to be followed by the action
Sure.
that Dr.
Yes.
Johnson was talking about, which is now folks are going to be evaluated on how well
Based
they
on
do
the-
this.
Absolutely.
Because you can have so many trainings.
Right.
I equate it to you can have so many cultural experiences, but if the performance reviews and if diversity is a part of that, it makes a difference. Because that holds people accountable.
We have a requirement at Suffolk now that every single person, down to every administrative assistant throughout the organization, has to have at least one diversity goal in their goals for the year. And of course, for many, it's many more than one, but it's a minimum standard. And you're absolutely right. Training is a necessary but not sufficient condition
basic,
for
right? It's the
doing these
basics.
things. It's basic. I mean, we've done tons of training, and yet we still have bias issues with faculty and staff that have to be dealt with. And
It's also role modeling. Andrea Silbert and I do some work together on the Women's Power Gap, and we went around and interviewed actually a lot of the presidents and chief diversity officers at one point. And one president told us that he held diversity training. And we said, and how was that? He said, oh, I didn't attend. I didn't need it. It was for my staff. So it's also, so we said, really? It's also the president leading by example.
Diversity is not something you do.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's easy to fall. Well, we did the training, check the box,
Yep.
and that's it.
Exactly.
You have to try and create a cultural environment
Yep.
where that's just it's not something out of the norm. It just is. You know, when we reach the point where we no longer have to talk about it, then we know we truly have created an environment where everybody feels like they belong, they're included, and it's just a natural state. That then becomes the new
You
normal.
make me think about, you know, in order to do that, you have to break down the institutionalized oppressive systems that exist, that were set up not for people like me to be in these institutions. And they permeate still today.
They permeate still today, and I think one of my earlier statements is that the first step is you have to recognize it. Second step is you have to deconstruct it. You can't, no, you can't change it. You have to deconstruct it systematically, brick by brick. In our case, we've been around for 100 years, so you know, you're not going to do it in 6 months,
Right.
right?
one of the more challenging things to come at this from another, in terms of deconstructing, is really the process, and we're just sort of tip of the iceberg on this, of deconstructing the curriculum in a sense.
Yes.
Not in terms of do you need a science course or not, but we've done, for example, we have a faculty fellow whose focused work is on diversity. It's a rotating position, and done a complete syllabus review for every course at the institution, and looking at, yes, maybe the learning objectives for, I'm making this up, right? Biology 101, I mean, fill in the blank. Maybe the learning objectives aren't any different, but you know what? Look at the authors that you're using,
That's
and
right.
are these all, you know, not to
Dead
pick on
white
white men,
men.
but all dead white men, and you know, and some of them should still be on the list, but
We need new
not
ones.
not all of it, and
That's right.
a lot of work to do still in that regard. But that's it. It has to go beyond the, you know, do you have a required course in diversity or require? Those are important things as well. But really looking at the way in which structural racism,
That's right.
and you know, sexism and is built into you know, long-standing
And hiring practices
structures.
are so critical. The hiring practices, unless you tackle how we're going to hire, what are our policies, what are our guidelines, how our search committees are constructed, what training do those hiring folks receive in order to do unbiased hiring, it's critical.
And it can't just be unbiased hiring. And I'll go back multiple institutions years ago. I took over a leadership role long before becoming a president. And it was an institution that had a lot of diversity on staff and within the administration. But they intentionally hired people of color who were not qualified. And I was number 2, number 3 person at the institution, and there was a running joke: if you met with Robert Johnson on a Thursday afternoon, you were probably going to get fired. No, I mean I turned over a lot of people. It was a change. The first 2 just happened by coincidence. Okay, it was just by coincidence. I wasn't paying attention. But the point being is, it was a different kind of structural and institutional racism because they created a self-fulfilling prophecy. We hired unqualified people of color, and then when they get there and they're incompetent, then the people who are not of color will say, see, they can't do the job. So I probably fired about 15 people within my first year or so. And 2/3 of them were people of color because they weren't qualified for the job. But then as we began to hire, we hired talent. So I think this thing about, we just want to check a box, to say that we have a person of color. I don't think that that's sufficient. We want qualified people, and they're out there.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm going to put both Dr. Kelly and Dr. Johnson a little bit on the hot seat, but not the hot seat.
She'll answer first.
I am interested in knowing and finding out if you, at your institutions, have seen the rise in anti-Semitism on your respective campuses, and what have you, if anything, put in place to ensure that students of all diverse backgrounds, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, country of origin, feel safe and protected on campus?
So in terms of whether or not we've seen a real rise in anti-Semitism, not in a visible, overt way. There hasn't been, we have been fortunate enough not to, have any of the, messages sent or posters put up, all across campus, or with that kind of a hate speech focus to it. And there hasn't been a rise in reports from students but I don't want to say publicly that we don't have it, because in fact we don't. It's still the case that you have to sometimes work to get students to report. We certainly have challenges as an institution like every other. I would say it's not been focused so much around anti-Semitism, and hopefully will not be. We're doing a climate survey this spring, and that will be really an important measure to get feedback from the entire community. And I could actually answer that question better at that point, because during COVID, we haven't done a climate survey in a few years, because during COVID, when we had so many students who were not on campus, it didn't make sense. They'd be assessing the climate of their bedroom at home where they were taking Zoom classes. So we really felt we had to wait until we got into a year that was normal from an operational perspective for us, and so we'll see. We do work hard to try to ensure that students feel safe on campus, and we don't always succeed, but mostly I'd like to think that we do. Part of that comes down to leadership as well. I mean, I think that there is hardly a speech or a conversation I have where inclusion in a variety of forms is not a part of what I'm talking about and writing about in messages to the community. And so that in and of itself helps. I tell students I have an open door policy, and I do. If my door is open, you come in and see me, and that, I think, helps them to feel like, okay, if I'm not sure who to go to, I know I can at least go to the president's office, and she'll either help me or help me figure out who I need to talk to. We have, student diversity. We have a huge number of what we I would put under the rubric of cultural clubs, everything from the Black Student Union to Hillel House. So that gives students that safe community. We have diversity peer educators, so those are students who can talk to other students about their issues. That's really, really helpful. But it's sort of endless. There's always more work to do in terms of making students feel, not just making them feel safe, have them actually be safe, physical and emotionally on campus.
Yeah, so our experience at Western New England, I would say, is very similar to Marissa's. We do, have issues like many college campuses, very much like Suffolk. I can't actually say that there's been a rise, but I acknowledge the fact that there are microaggressions all over the place, right? And and knock on wood, we've not had anything blatant outwardly in public, but there have been things here and there, and we try and address them as they come along. I think that this comes back to leadership setting cultural norms and expectations, and not just of faculty and staff, but also of our students, and trying to create an environment where people do belong, where they are included, not believe, but they are. And I think that's an ongoing process. And I think COVID has masked a lot of things because, as Marissa was saying, I've been at Western New England, this is going into my third year. I started right at the beginning of COVID in August of 2020. This really feels like my first year. And I had just had open student office hours earlier this week, and students come in and they talk and what have you. So I think we have to create this environment where we are engaging students on every level, and and I tell my leaders, and I try not to do it as well. When you're walking across campus, put your phones up. Take a minute, talk to a student, right?
Martha, do you want to add anything? And then we'll open it up for questions.
Just made me think about both of what you were talking about. It's so much about relationship and embracing people for who they are. And it starts with leadership, sort of, sampling or setting the example of how you do that. Your comment about when you're walking through campus, put your phone down and say hello. So many people just walk like this on their phones and never lift their heads.
Are doing it all the time.
Yeah.
And I stop them. Hey.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Speak of a phone.
So it's all about relationship and intentionality.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to finish by saying, that it's all about relationship and intentionality.
Yes. We want to open this up for questions. Anyone? Yes.
That's a loaded question. So in terms of the classroom, faculty, they do have academic freedom to, talk about whatever they feel is relevant to the lesson that they are teaching. And I don't think it is our role to tell them what they should or should not be doing in that regard. I do think it's important that if we have set cultural norms in terms of behavior of what is acceptable and not acceptable, that is a reasonable expectation. But Yeah, I would not expect, hate to be spewed, in the classroom. That doesn't mean you can't talk about race or religion or, progressives or conservatives or anything in that regard, because it comes back to my very basic principles that we must have civility, mutual respect, and civil discourse with a sense of humanity. So if we're doing that in and out of the classroom, talk about whatever you want to talk about, because it should be an educational process. Let me give you an example. So I was at an institution. I was the first black vice president they had in their over 150-year history. I was walking across the campus one day, and a woman walked up to me and said, Robert, I just don't get it. Why can't you just assimilate? Why do I need to understand what your experience is like? And my Uncle Bob, who used to run Jet Magazine, he used to say, when you come across someone like that, your initial response in your head is that you want to take their head off. But he said, you need to understand that they're operating out of a paradigm of ignorance. So you need to engage them. So I engaged her, and she wasn't really being mean. She was, and as I began to talk to her, she was really trying to understand. So we began to develop a relationship, a friendship, and our campus wasn't too far from downtown. One day we went to lunch, and we went into a soul food restaurant, okay? And we walked there, and when we walked in, it was just like one of those barroom scenes. Almost a hush came over the room for about a millisecond. Then everybody, and she got the stares and all of that kind of stuff. And I didn't say anything, and we were laughing and having a good time, but I could tell she was feeling it. And when we started walking back, I said, so how did you like the food? Food was great. So, what about the experience? She said, I felt so uncomfortable. I said, why? She said, because of the way people were looking at me and the way that they made me feel. And I said, you know what? Every day when I step foot on this campus, that's my experience from the time I step foot on it to the time I leave. And all of a sudden, this light bulb came on for her, and she had this epiphany. She says, I finally get it. I finally get it. And so I think that, we have to, simply because somebody says something or does something, does not necessarily mean that they are an evil person. It's ignorance. And as an educated citizen, all of us have a responsibility to engage them. Now, there's some people, no matter what you say or what you do, they're not there. I don't spend too much more time with them. But if they're serious, let's have the conversation.
But what happens in classrooms sometimes is that the comments get ignored or hushed. And that's dangerous because that remains there it's the elephant in the room. It's, it's always there. And so, from my experience, having faculty really learn how to facilitate that dialogue is critical, and it doesn't happen very often. That's part of the training that takes place. And I say faculty or teachers because you said classroom, but it happens in meetings. It happens, in administrative meetings as well. But we're not used to facilitating tough dialogue.
Scott?
Thanks very much, and yes, and thank you all for being here and engaging in this conversation. So this might be a hard question. It's based on a number of experiences I've seen on various campuses. So as Jewish person with Jewish kids, I recognize the great history of allyship Well, so now was that a surprise to any of the folks in the panel? If so, or if not, how do we approach that? What can the administration do? In a related question, Dr. Johnson gave us a very interesting example of the idea of Louis Farrakhan and Netanyahu being on the same stage. I would suggest that would never happen.
Well, yeah.
Weird dynamic.
Right.
But because the student groups who are by and large are bringing in the speakers are bringing in their person,
Right.
and the people who in that message may not, not just not resonate, but be sufficiently unhearable that people will feel threatened by that message, and then another group will all exclusionary. You'll never see the two on the same stage in dialogue.
Right.
And so actually, it's a separating kind of situation. So if you could just comment on those things.
So it's a great question. I'm not surprised to hear that students of Jewish students, maybe your children, maybe not, feel pressure to check some part of themselves at the door. I don't have any examples of that have been brought to my attention on Suffolk's campus, but I do know that there are examples of that happening without question, and it happens. I think it happens between students. I think it's a challenge for faculty, and frankly, I think it is something that we have a responsibility to actively work to correct. I don't know the easiest, best way to do that, but it comes really under this notion of, civility and inclusion. And inclusion has to include people with whom we disagree. We have to do a better job of that on campuses. And I'll give an example just because it's one that caused me a little bit of a little bit of challenge, but I think we finally got to a good place. It's not the same thing that you're talking about, but it's the approach I think we need to take to many issues. So inclusive restrooms, right? So students, and this was 2 years ago, no, it was pre-COVID. Anyway, it doesn't matter when it was. The Student Government Association passed a resolution that all restrooms should be made gender non-binary, gender inclusive restrooms. And honestly, I said no, because we do have, we're never going to check someone's birth certificate, right? You go to the restroom that is appropriate to your identity. But there are absolutely people who are not necessarily, trying to be discriminatory, who feel that they prefer to be in a restroom only with women or people who identify as female and vice versa. So I said instead, to be truly inclusive, and that includes, people on the more conservative end of that question, within one floor of every classroom and office, there has to be a restroom that matches so there are a bunch of gender non-binary restrooms on campuses on different floors, and there are gender exclusive restrooms, male and female, so that everybody within a reasonable distance of their classroom, their office, their club room, whatever it might be, has a place that they can go and be comfortable. Now, totally different situation, but it is, I think, something that we have to work hard. I mean, students expected me to say, yes, absolutely, we'll do that. We'll change all the bathrooms over, and expected it in part because of my own identity as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and because I talk a lot about inclusion, and just assumed that meant that and they were surprised by that. I do think that we have to work harder to be sure that as we are being inclusive, we also have to be politically inclusive in terms of views on the question of Israel or anything else, and as long as it's not done in a context of hate.
Right.
I mean, that has to be off limits.
Right, I agree. I like Marissa, I am not surprised about students being asked to check their identity at the door. I am surprised about, being quizzed about, what is your view on Israel? And if you don't give what they perceive to be the right answer, then you're not included. I think that is absolutely wrong. Look, we are we are a multicultural, multiracial, multi-everything society, and somehow or the other we have to figure out a way to break down the echo chambers that where people are, associating themselves only with people who are like them. I think one of the challenges you were talking about back with Dr. and King and the civil rights movement, and people who are black and Jewish and what have you coming together, fighting a common cause. Our kids today, mine included, 25 and 27 and 29, they never saw what I saw when I was growing up, when my dad was chief of dietetic services and took a job in Battle Creek, Michigan at the VA hospital. And when he first arrived there in 1974, there was literally a sign in 1974 at the water fountain that said black only and white only. I saw that, okay? My kids have never seen anything like that. So we have a generation of young people who have never, up until George Floyd and these most recent incidents, have never seen in your face blatant racism, people literally dying in real time, with a knee on their neck, or back in the day, being strung from a tree and what have you. So part of it is what's being taught in the classrooms, from kindergarten through the 12th grade and on our campuses in terms of history, and telling all elements of history and not skewing it one way or the other.
We'll take one more question and then we'll wrap.
So, Maritza, I was struck in an agreement with you when you talked about the fellow, to look at the learning goals in the syllabi, to ensure that there were concepts around inclusion and diversity. My question is, how do they go over with the faculty as they balance things like academic freedom?
So certainly for some, I think it was controversial. And just to clarify, there certainly were courses where specific learning objectives around diversity and inclusion were critical, but even at a more basic level, looking at materials and things like that, so that it was not about changing the learning objectives for a faculty member, but helping them to see the way in which there were, structural racism was built into the way the course was structured, the materials on which it was founded. And because of that, it actually went over well with more faculty than you would think. It was not a process of your syllabus has to be approved or not approved. That would have been a bridge too far from an academic freedom perspective. But it was intended to be an educational moment, right? Let's look at, okay, across our curriculum, first of all, we have X number of courses where we really feel like they got this right and X number where they don't. And then the opportunity for faculty to have, to say, oh, you're right. I mean, I never thought about the fact that, even I'm teaching science, but in fact there's racism built into the constructs of science as well. And if I bring different materials to this, it will bring a different perspective on these questions and enhance student learning without undermining my content. And so, for many, it was, and it's an ongoing process. I think for some, there was a lot of, hand-wringing, raised eyebrows. This is political correctness run amok. But because we didn't take the step of saying, you have to do X, Y, or Z, that kind of stuff died down pretty quickly. But it's an ongoing project.
Were you saying something?
Quick question, Dr. Johnson, or anyone else. You had talked about how, you first have to deconstruct, right, in order to then construct and rebuild intentionally and with courage. How patient are students and or faculty when, they either hear that or think it's too slow, or, how do you
Well, so first of all, I don't tell them we're deconstructing it. We just do that. I think you have to run two parallel tracks, right? You have to do some things that are substantive where you can see some immediacy in terms of the kinds of things that are being done. But those immediate things in and of itself may or may not necessarily be a long-term solution. So like we've done a climate survey. We're now taking a look at the results of that climate survey. We're going to create training and what have you. That's not going to deconstruct the institutional piece. We have policies that are inherently biased, and that takes time in order to deconstruct it. Marissa talked about the process with looking at the syllabus and what have you. Well, that's you're not going to do that in 6 months, probably not even a year. By the time it's fully implemented, it's 2 or 3 years. But if you're running these parallel tracks where you're doing some immediate things that are moving the ball down the road, ultimately you will get there, and there should be a point at some time in the future where there's a convergence where it looks like you just did it overnight, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're excited about convening we've reaffirmed the core values of the institution, and now there is a whole plan for implementing the rollout of that and engaging the students, the faculty, the staff in the conversations about how do we live these values? How do our actions reflect what we believe in and what we hold dear? From planet Earth. And you make me think that acknowledging our own lived experiences is really key, because we
That's
bring
right.
our whole selves into the
That's right.
situation.
That's right.
Well, I want to thank each of you for your brilliance, for your commitment to inclusion. I know each of you and what you're doing in your respective institutions, and I so admire that in making a difference. And because campuses are the epicenter of where the next generation, evolves and learn and change come about. And what you're doing is really creating space, holding space for young people to become global citizens with a lens towards equity and impact and inclusion and belonging. So I want to thank you all for taking the time to I know it's a long day for a president, and you have so much on your schedule.
Every day is a long
And-
day.
But this is such an important
And
topic.
this is
It
an
is.
important
It
topic,
really
and I
is.
want to thank all of you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. So, thank you all. Have a nice rest of the day, and we'll be back.